Hello and welcome everyone. My name is Beate Kubitz and I'm a consultant in future mobility, working on demand responsive transport as well as things like bike share and active travel and linking together various forms of transport through mobility as a service. I'm a fellow of the Foundation for Integrated Transport and also an associate lecturer at the University of Hertfordshire on their future mobility modules. So we're all here to talk about demand responsive transport and look at some of the practical as well as the things that will make it successful in terms of the research that we've done around the subject. Just to welcome, we have a panel of very informed people for you today. Jack Holland, the head of business development in the UK for Padam Mobility. Padam's a French demand responsive transport platform that has a number of developments in France and one or two now launching in the UK. So Jack's going to talk about some of the practical aspects of setting up the demand responsive transport. We have Claire Walters from Bus Users UK. Claire's the chief executive and she's going to talk about Bus Users UK research into demand responsive transport and how what people want from DRT. Andrew Highfield from Hertfordshire County Council has recently launched HeartLink's demand responsive transport service. So we're going to talk to him a bit about how that's gone and some of the issues and experiences that he's had doing that to create a new kind of service in Hertfordshire. And Simon Lusby, the head of transport planning for City Science, will talk about research he's done into how to configure demand responsive transport in the context of London. So really informed panel. We've got 4 presentations followed by a panel discussion, and you can ask questions. Please do ask questions, and I'll be fielding those and putting them to the panelists. So please post any questions into the questions panel for the GoToWebinar, and thank you very much for being here. Just hand over to Jack when you're ready.
Jack, you're currently on mute.
Okay, brilliant. Sorry, I was unable to take mute off there. It was very strange. Thank you, Beate, for the introduction, and thanks all for joining today. Over the next 10 minutes or so, I will be going through some practical examples of how to make a DRT work and how to integrate it into a wider network based on my personal experience launching DRTs and also the experience of the wider Padam team. Next slide, please. So just a very brief introduction. Padam, to start with, launched about 7 years ago. They've currently got 80 live operations across the globe. And this year they're on course to hit around about 1 million passenger journeys on their platform. For the first few years of Padam's existence, they tested out different business models with DRT. They partnered with a wide range of different transport authorities, testing the different levers and measures that you can use, both in terms of the algorithms themselves, but also in terms of the practical implementation of DRT. From myself, I started my career with Arriva and launched the Arriva Click project in 2017 as one of the founding team for that project. That was the first digital demand responsive bus service to launch using the app in the UK, and then later on worked with house builders and the local authority to launch a Section 106 funded digital DRT in New Lowestoft. So I've got a number of years experience in launching DRT, and yeah, just really today we'll be going through some practical tips to integrate it into a wider network. Next slide, please. So I suppose the work starts really before any sort of implementation begins. I think it's really important to do a very deep analysis of where the gaps are in the transport network, where DRT could work, and also testing out the different constraints that you can implement with a DRT service. So by this, I mean doing actual tests to see if you have a feeder service, what's the knock-on impact of that onto the interurban bus route, and there's a number of different ways to do that. You can go straight to a provider themselves and they can do an analysis, or actually there's a number of simulation tools that are on the market from independent providers that can help you have a real deep understanding of where the gaps are in your network and how DRT could be able to help. So for example, we would recommend a company called Prospective Labs. They have a comprehensive tool and they've worked with the likes of First, Stagecoach and authorities across the UK to test not just where DRT could work, but also to how it could reshape the existing transport network. And they run a number of sort of cost benefit analysis that show if you put this extra vehicle in, how much would it cost, but how much patronage would it add. So I think it's really important to get that understanding even before starting to shape your thoughts on what DRT could bring. And similarly, on the next slide, this can help to shape what type of DRT to implement. So the market has expanded quite a lot recently since the first sort of dynamic digital apps begun, and you can do corner-to-corner DRT where there may be 1,000-2,000 stops in an area. You can do bus stop to bus stop DRT where maybe there's only 100 to 150 stops. So the analysis will help to shape what style of DRT to implement, and as the examples are on the bottom, it can also help to shape exactly the perimeters. So a DRT that maybe everyone's aware of is the free floating, where you can go from any stop to any stop, but actually analysis may show that a feeder system would be more beneficial because 90% of people between 7 and 9 want to get to a train station, and by using the constraints of the system, you'll be able to carry more people and have a higher grouping rate on board the vehicle. Next slide, please. And it's not just analysis pre-launch. It's really, really important to do the analysis continually post-launch. And so by this, I mean, it's using the analytical tools, the BI reporting, to see what's working well and potentially looking at what's working well and enhancing it with maybe more stops in that area, or limiting the stops at certain times so more people can get to a specific point, but also looking at what's not working particularly well and changing it, because it's all about continual improvement, analyzing the data and really having a continuous refined model to make sure that the supply is matching the demand. Next slide. So that's really everything to do with the sort of data analysis side. Now in terms of the actual sort of practical platform abilities, it's really important from our point of view, from Padam and our experience, to have a platform that gives equal weighting to pre-bookings and real time. And by that, I mean that pre-bookings are guaranteed at the point that the booking is made, and I'll show you on the next 2 slides about the differences between some of the platforms and where the importance of pre-booking comes in. So if you could skip to the next slide, please. So some platforms come from a kind of Uber model where they work exceptionally well in very, very urban environments, maybe zones 1 to 4 of London, maybe New York, maybe Manchester Leeds city centre within the inner ring roads. They are very, very good at on-demand bookings, and the algorithms are very good at maybe grouping people together on demand. But sometimes the pre-booking was an afterthought for some of these platforms, and they provide ETAs for pre-bookings, and then 30 minutes before departure, the pre-bookings are put into a funnel, and if there's too many on-demand bookings at the same time as the pre-booking, what often happens is that the pre-booking can't be guaranteed, and the user will get a message to say, sorry, there's no space available at the moment, please try again, even if the pre-booking was made weeks in advance. Next slide, please. We think that it's important to do things slightly differently and have an optimized DRT platform. And what I mean by this is, when the booking is made, putting that booking into a shadow schedule and having that booking confirmed at the point of booking. So what the Padam platform does, for example, and potentially some of the other platforms who use this style of booking, is there'll be a window given to the user, and you'll know that you're picked up no earlier than, say, 10 AM, and you'll be dropped off at the departure point no later than 10:30, and that is set. And then what happens is, on the day of the trip, the system will re-optimize and look to find deficiencies, but always in the perimeters of the time window given to the user's bookings. So it might be that the user is picked up at 10:05, but as long as he's at his destination by 10:30, the system knows to sort of adapt and make sure that booking's confirmed. Next slide, please. It's really, really important to have a clear and robust schedule for implementation. So if, for example, something happens where there's a serious delay in procurement, or there's a hold up, it's very, very important to not try to rush the training. So we'd recommend at least 2 weeks of direct field testing. In terms of training staff, it's very important to have super users and to make sure that they are able to train others when new people come to the company. Next slide, please. Apologies, I'm going to rush through some of the last ones because I'm coming up to my time limit. But in terms of marketing, digital marketing is key. It's traceable. You can see click-through rates. You can see the impact of your spend, and you can see how much money you've put into digital marketing, and you can literally see the customer journey to how many times a customer who's seen that advert has used the system. So incredibly important tool. Retention acquisition flows are incredibly important as well. You can target people who potentially have used you a couple of times, but then maybe haven't used you for a few weeks. You can send them offers and get them back into using the system. Things like refer a friend and promo codes, really, really useful tools. Okay, next slide. Payment processing systems, very important to do research. We'd recommend using someone like Stripe, because they have excellent customer service, and it's just vitally important to have a very good PSP. Next slide. So yeah, it's important that the app has lots of different levers to engage with customers, be it push and pull notifications. If a vehicle is broke down or stuck in severe traffic, it's vital that the user has a way of being notified through in-app notifications, SMS, or even email. So making sure you have that full range of engagement tools to contact the user. Next slide. one of the really things that we think is important is to make sure that the platform has the capability for a real aftercare service. It's not just here's the platform, off you go, but there's a drumbeat of weekly meetings, there's a drumbeat of analysis and partnership working, and making sure that the operator and the call center and all of different components understand the system and help guide them through, especially the first 4 weeks after launch. And next and final slide, please. And it's also important to have one eye on not just the trial and the potential small service, but make sure that the platform is capable of expanding in a big way, integrating with other systems. So, for example, looking at if the platform has a partnership with a ticketing provider such as Ticketer. So we're working with Ticketer to integrate DRT ticketing with fixed line. So over the next sort of 6 to 9 months, users will be able to buy a ticket on our app and have a multi-leg offer, so that they can then go onto a First or an Arriva bus with one ticket, one QR code, making it as simple as possible for users to not have to download lots of different apps, making sure that the platform has integrated or the ability to integrate with mass providers, they have a clear and simple open API that works effectively in integrating into other platforms. So I think it's really important to sort of make sure that the platform is scalable. And that's it. So apologies if I overran by a couple of minutes, but thank you. And yeah, if you've got any questions, I think there's going to be Q&A after all the presentations.
Thanks, Jack. Really interesting presentation. We're going to move over on to Claire Walters, the Chief Executive of Bus Users at UK now. Welcome, Claire.
Hi there. Hello, I hope you can hear me. Nobody's telling me they can't hear me, so I'll just carry on as if we're there. Now, I'm very happy to be here today, although the sharp-eyed amongst you will note that I am not actually Dawn Badminton-Katz, our Director for England. I'm a last-minute substitution, because she can't be here, ironically, because of a public transport failure. She left London at 5:30 last night, and at 10:30 p.m. I got a message saying she was just passing Leeds on her way to Newcastle. So maybe we need train service improvement plans around the country. Anyway, that's not why I'm here. We want to talk about direct demand responsive transport and its role in BSIPs. Bus Users is a UK charity that's all about accessible and inclusive travel, so for everyone. So we need to work out how the DRT aspect of this works for everyone. Next slide, please. The intention of the BSIPs is to look across the whole transport network and consult deeply. That's been very clearly stated, to make sure that the needs of everyone in the area are met as far as possible. I mean, how one was quite meant to do that in the timescale that they gave everyone is another matter, but the aims are definitely laudable. So when you're up against a deadline, it's really, really tempting just to stay with what you know, add in a couple of extra routes or expand the hours of operation a wee bit. And then expect some kind of demand responsive transport to fill in all the gaps. I mean, community transport operators will be familiar with a particular magic wand approach. It's not a great way to start. Talking of which, if your BSIP hasn't taken notice of what your local community transport operators are doing in the area, you need to rectify that as soon as possible, because otherwise you will not have a full picture. Community transport operators usually have a very, very good set of insights into what the needs are of the people who are hard to reach. Now, if you haven't got that, then time to start. So there have been, with apologies to Jack, the DRT services that we've had experience of have not been great, and they haven't always succeeded. Now, there are some honourable exceptions, but they quite often get set up to plug a few gaps and tick a few boxes. So we think that the concept needs quite a radical overhaul in order to be a good addition to any BSIP or to the public transport jigsaw, if you like. Now, there can be a lot of things that put people off using DRT, or indeed put it out of the reach of many. The lack of spontaneity is a massive one. Having to book a long way in advance simply isn't feasible for many people. People with caring responsibilities whose charges may be great one day and then not the next. Or with illnesses that flare up suddenly or come in waves like arthritis or indeed many mental health conditions. You need a system that allows for same-day reservation also. There's a pretty good example in Bookabus in South Wales, which does have this kind of interactivity at a level and via modes that are accessible to people. One of the big bugbears has always been if they don't accept concessionary travel cards, if they're not part of the scheme, because it just puts the whole thing out of reach for an awful lot of people. I think the one that annoys more people is only taking bookings via an app or online. There are still thousands of people who don't have access to the internet, access to smartphones. I mean, 35% of over 65 don't have a smartphone. Even if you've got online access somewhere, or even if you've got a smartphone, there are plenty of people in rural areas who can't get the signal unless they're standing one-legged on the roof pointing it north. So you really need a staff telephone line for this to work. A call centre sounds much more exotic than it needs to be. It can be just a few people, but it does need to be one with reasonable working hours that are just a couple of hours each morning, for instance, which we have seen. The service itself also needs to run at the hours that it's needed. Again, your residents should tell you what they need, but the kind of old style approach of just getting people into a biggish town nearby by 11 AM and then getting them back on board to go home again at midday just isn't going to cut it. You need to think about the people who have medical appointments they can't change, working hours that don't conform to the 9 to 5, which isn't a huge proportion of the young and the non-office-based workers. Even those only wanting to go shopping once a week need more than an hour in the town. You need to develop it as if you were launching a proper commercial product. So you need to do your market research. Accessibility is another issue that doesn't come up often enough. It's obviously you have to have low floor and wheelchair accessible vehicles available, and there really isn't any excuse for having not having space for people who've booked. So if you work out as best you can in advance what's needed, and then if something happens, you need a plan B. You need a backup option, even if it's sending out a private car to scoop up those who were able to get in one if you've made a mistake. So things happen, but you need to be able to make sure you can cope with the mistakes that happen. So I think we've all realised that there have been a lot of changes in a short time because of the pandemic. I mean, the biggest one, obviously, is the move towards hybrid working for those who can do some of their job from home. If we're really going to deal with that, you're going to need transport offers that are going to live up to the rhetoric about climate change, convenience, sort out the congestion which plagues so many of our towns and cities, not to mention some of the more rural trunk roads, or even just access roads that get bunged up all the time. Wherever possible, you just need to have a scheduled bus service. That should be the aim, the gold standard. Along with a lot of work to ensure that other shared and active transport options are available. This makes sense as it all makes a big step forward in allowing people to confidently leave the car at home. But DRT really needs to be part of the picture when it's not possible, it's not practical to run a full-time, useful, accessible and affordable and reliable bus service. I mean, it does sound like nirvana, but there we go. You have to really think about the role of DRT right at the beginning of your enhanced partnership planning process. It really has to be baked in at the start and ensure that it goes properly connected with other modes, key services. And I know this sounds a daft thing to say, but it needs to go where people want to get to. It's often an element that isn't really researched hard enough in our experience, but there we go. That's all going to change now. Whatever service you put in place, if it's a connection service, feeder service, that kind of thing, you need to take into account where people's end destination is likely to be, so that it doesn't require a vast amount of changes. But I mean, it's not at all unreasonable to have feeder services to main trunk services, but you have to know that this is not intended to replace taxi services. You will only have a successful service if it's based on what people actually need. And I'm afraid that means you actually have to get out there and talk to people, not just do an online survey for all the reasons I talked about before. Local radio is actually quite a good place to start the conversation going. So in summary, all the vehicles, all the infrastructure, all of it needs to be fully accessible, not just to wheelchair users, which is what people tend to think about, but for the digitally excluded as well. It has to work for people who have an onward journey to plan so that it fits in with scheduled services from rail stations or coach stations. And I'll keep harping on this idea of making sure people can make appointments, to get to appointments, I mean, that they can't change. Doctors, interviews, that sort of stuff. I'm sorry I can't have the interview for the job, but I can't get there till 11 AM. Doesn't hold you in good stead for getting the job. It really has to be easy for people to book, to alter, to update, so that they don't get frustrated and say, oh, forget it, if they've got an option. This has to be seen as a commercial product. You're competing with private car convenience. Never, ever forget that. If there are local authority people here, you might consider setting up a public transport challenge week for all your staff and members to attend all meetings, all office-based work by public transport and only public transport. That should tell you quite a lot of what you need to know about the gaps in provision in your area. It's also critical that the service isn't a fly-by-night thing. You need to build trust and confidence. Give it time for word of mouth to spread. Make sure people get used to the idea that they really do have a reliable option. That way you stand a decent chance of filling the gaps in your BSIP properly and getting people to not rely wholly on their own cars. Okay, well, that's pretty much me. And if you have questions, please put them in the chat and I'm happy to take them as and when. Thanks for having me.
Thank you very much, Claire. We're going to move on to Andrew Highfield, the Head of Integrated Transport for Hertfordshire County Council. Thanks, Andrew.
Good morning. Thank you for having me today. My name is Andrew Highfield, Head of Integrated Transport for Hertfordshire County Council. And I want to share today how we developed and introduced a demand responsive service in our county, which we have branded HeartLinks. Next slide, please. Firstly, I think it's important to start with why we felt a demand responsive service was so vital to try in the area we identified. As you can see on this map analysis, to the northeast of the county, around Buntingford, there is a large swathe of area poorly served by traditional fixed bus routes. Whilst there have been some low frequency routes in the northeast of the county for a number of years, public transport has just not been serving these communities as well as it could. Next slide, please. And that was our first why to do this: to improve public transport connections but we wanted to do that to improve access to education, workplaces and leisure trips. Reducing social isolation has been at the heart of how we have designed Herts Links. But it's also been critical to design a service that will offer on average shorter wait times, shorter distances to stops and shorter journey times. Next slide, please. All of these components enabled us to draft a strong business case to submit to the Department for Transport as part of the Rural Mobility Fund in early 2021. And it definitely feels a lot longer ago than that. And we were successful, which, as you can imagine, we were delighted with. This enabled the team, and particularly our project manager, Alice, to get cracking. So coming on to the what we have done. Alice and the team designed the service zone area you can see, still centred around Buntingford, with connections in the free floating zone and 6 key town hubs surrounding. There was also specification work to decide on the operating hours, with the key decision being that we wanted Herts Links to cover as much of the day initially, but had to be realistic around operating hours and costs, which led us to launching with a base 7 to 7 service Monday to Saturday, with a 10 till 4 service on Sundays. The team then worked to confirm the amount of vehicles needed for our forecasted patronage and to match our operating hours. It was also critical for us to overcome some of the previous barriers that have existed with DRT, as demonstrated by Claire in the presentation we just had. We wanted the security of bookings for passengers. We have chosen to accept concessionary passes in our local Saver Card scheme, which gives half-price travel for 11 to 25-year-olds. We have introduced a phone line for bookings, as well as the app and website, and we've procured new high-spec, truly accessible vehicles. Next slide, please. Now a bit on how we did it. The team designed a great marketing plan focused around touring the key town hubs with the Herts Links vehicle over the summer. These went down tremendously with the local communities and allowed us to get word out on the ground. Underpinning this was a new media and traditional media strategy with links into social media campaigns, as well as more traditional leaflet drops and a fantastic animated video on YouTube, which you can watch later. Behind the scenes, the team were working diligently on the various components for the service, with Padam Mobility signing up as our tech partner for the service and Uno operating the service on our behalf. The team bought the vehicles and branded them prior to launch. Next slide, please. The launch was in mid-September at our council headquarters. It was a fantastic afternoon to showcase the vehicles and the technology. Following the launch, we were straight into service launch on the following Sunday. Next slide, please. Now the slide everyone is probably most interested. How has it gone so far? Pretty well in conclusion. These stats are from just a few weeks into the service, but our weekday averages are pretty close to our forecasted and patronage is holding well across the week. As you can see, Sunday is where we need to do a bit more work on boosting numbers, but the team are already looking at identifying ways we can boost patronage at underutilised times. The team are also looking at introducing more virtual bus stops based on where we believe we can unlock demand. In terms of journeys, the map on the right shows a really varied use, but as expected, a lot of links into Buntingford in the centre, with the main town hubs being served frequently also. The granularity of data as compared to a traditional fixed route bus service has really enabled us to get ahead of teething troubles, and passenger feedback has enabled us to be close to the performance of the service. In conclusion, it's early days, but we are really optimistic about the potential of Herts Links, both as a brand that can work in North East Herts, but also can be scaled up across the county, if necessary. And this is a central ambition of our bus service improvement plan. However, we are realistic that demand responsive services need to be integrated into communities and the public transport offering. That's why in Hertfordshire, we're still fully focused on a total transport strategy that also links into public and community transport, working closely with community transport providers as we have done over the summer, and our own council fleet, school transport, dial-a-ride services and bus operators. That's all from me. Thanks for watching and listening.
Thank you very much, Andrew. We're going to move on to Simon, who is the Head of Transport Planning for City Science. Are you there, Simon?
Hi, thanks for that. Always really interesting to follow Claire. It saves me saying a lot of things that her and I agree on. So that's really great. And nice to hear from Andrew again, who I haven't seen since our TFL days together. So I'm just going to go through some of the building blocks of DRT that I think we just have to make sure that we keep in mind when we're designing these or considering these. Yeah, if we can move to the first slide, that would be great. So some of this is going to align very much with what Claire said, but a key thing is it has to be fully accessible. So we can't have people left behind as part of this process. You can't just put in just minivans and assume that's going to solve it. It needs to be an accessible service, because what we're trying to implement here is the equivalent of a bus network, but that serves rural communities or hard to reach communities. So it needs to be able to meet those same requirements that we'd expect of a bus service, that it's for everyone in the community, and it's about supporting that community. The next thing is needs to be zero emission fleet, and we're seeing that with the offers that are coming through now, where the type of fleet is definitely in that space. Then needs to address those core passenger needs. One of those is actually taking people where they need to go, but there are the wider, just simple needs of a passenger that we need to make sure that we're capturing that. And then also there's the security element that we've seen with ride hailing and other processes like those, that we need to make sure that we're capturing with this. And the technology within the vehicles we should be able to manage that quite well. But that's the security of the passengers as well as the security of the driver. And then also the amenities and considerations of amenities and facilities for drivers. Driver facilities to be able to go to the bathroom or get water or food are often not covered. And as part of this, we need to make sure that that's tied into your plan. It might not be the front and center of it, unlike it is on my first slide, but it needs to make sure that it's tied in there. Then also that spatial and temporal coverage, but that's already kind of been covered. But we need to, I'll get onto that in a moment, but the type of people that we're looking to, the type of trips that you're going to get, it's at different times of day. And so we need to make sure we're covering those. And then also that it's actually meaning that it needs the community. Claire covered this quite well, actually, that you just need to actually engage with the community and find out what they need, and then work within that space. Next slide, please. So that was about getting the basics right first. Then you got to think about what are you actually integrating with. So the key thing is feeding rail and feeding bus services. A DRT is not going to replace a core mass bus corridor, but what it could do is actually feed into that and support it, as long as the ticketing is worked to enable to do that. But also there's other community type services, business services, school services, services for mobility impaired users, and hospital services that can potentially be tied into this, so that you're actually there's already funding for those types of services. The more you can integrate those in and have a one-stop shop for this, for mobility and demand responsive travel, and book travel there as well, the more likely that such a service is going to be able to be there and actually continue to operate longer term. Next slide, please. Sound like sorry, it's like my kids asking to, can we just go on the next slide? Can we go to the swings? Sorry. Then the next thing is it's a service to everyone. And if anyone based in London, you'll see dial a ride driving around that's moving one person at a time, and it's showing there's an inefficiency there. And it needs to not be about that, but also it can't just be about commuters, because if a service is just running when commuting is happening, then it's not picking up the needs of the elderly, the needs of the mobility impaired, children, and when they need to travel, and shoppers traveling into peak, which is often when bus services are actually managing that sort of demand. Night workers in the nighttime economy as well, where if the service just stops in the evening, then those people, like if you have to work late, you won't be able to get home. Or if you already work overnight, you won't actually be able to access those jobs. So it's about providing the access that fundamentally public transport would normally do. And then education as well, and also making sure that we're working for lower income groups. So really about there, it's about making sure that the service is temporarily across the right amount of the day at the right sort of frequency, and it doesn't just stop and leave people stranded. And also that the concessions are being accounted for. That was one thing that we were seeing when I was at TfL, was people were coming to us and saying, we want to run a DRT, and we're like, well, you have to provide for these users and the freedom passes and school children, and they were like, oh no, we're not going to do that, we're just going to provide a service. It's like, no, you actually have to provide for the whole community here and align with what the rest of the council's requirements are for services. And then also about securing local support. So integrating the fares. You buy a ticket on the DRT, you should then be able to get onto the bus service. You actually having bus lanes past congestion, even if it's just a short section of bus lane, but allowing those DRT services to use that. They're unlikely to be able to justify bus lanes everywhere, but at least in some locations, whether it's as you enter into a town centre, the DRT can actually get into into a bus lane, or if it's to bypass congestion on a motorway. Those elements are really going to help, and that's all about getting people actually where they need to be. And as Claire put it, providing that advantage over car, because that is really what you're competing with here. Is the person's alternative is either to take a car or potentially not to travel. The not to travel is where we all end up exactly how we were in 2020, where we were barely seeing each other. So we don't want to go back to that. We don't want social isolation, and we want the economy to prosper from this, and people to feel connected, and they've got that option that isn't just a car. Again, providing driver facilities and actually providing those spaces to stop and wait. So this is where the local council needs to not just say, okay, go and do it. They need to be thinking, how is this actually going to be tying in? And it sounds like Andrew's really been picking that up, which is really reassuring. And then also point 2 there about connecting community amenities. So actually, where do people want to go and need to go, and making sure that those are part of that network. And we saw that in the first set of slides where there were locations just outside which were also being captured. Next slide. And then also bridging that gap, so that differential between car and such service, while also making sure that we're going beyond the funding that is going to be available through the BSIP program. So road user charging, emission charging, not always going to be able to happen in rural areas, but there may be some opportunities for parking fees, workplace parking, using routes that are have higher demand on them to potentially fund some of these services, whether it's advertising or, again, integrating those existing services into it, where there's already funding from businesses and other organizations to supply such a service. So working with them to try and build up an offer. So it's not just approaching the council and the council funding the entire service and taking the loss. There needs to be a bit more of a planning as to how else can funding come in, and what else services can support. Next slide, please. And then just a reminder, so if you want to hear any more about what I had views on the BSIP, you can go to the previous webinar we did on BSIPs beforehand. But the key things are, it's not just about running small buses around communities. It's about actually creating that community cohesion, improving air quality by reducing congestion, reducing the need to take a car or own a car, and connecting people. So that we always have to keep that in mind. If it's not just a bus service, it's about connecting people together, making streets safer, and actually helping the economy to prosper. So that's all from me. Look forward to questions. Thanks a lot.
Thank you very much, Simon. And can I ask everyone to rejoin us for the panel discussion, please? Hello, everyone. Great. So whilst you've all been talking, there have been loads of questions coming in. And before we kind of go to audience questions, which kind of fall into a number of different groups about profitability or commercial viability, whether we're replacing or augmenting services, there are lots of different groups of questions. I wondered if you had any questions for each other, because this has really been an interesting and informative session. We've had Andrew explaining how the Hearts Links service answered a lot of Claire's kind of concerns about DRT, and the concessionary passes, disabled access, all sorts of things. I don't know if either of you have got questions for each other about, have we got it right yet? Jack, Simon, do you have questions for Andrew or Claire?
Yeah, I'd like to get Claire's point of view in the best way to reach not just passengers of DRT/bus, but actually trying to engage with people who don't use bus, and any experience from bus users in the UK about getting their thoughts and how to then implement that in actual operations.
Well, as Simon was saying, really, the only way, the only way you can really get out there is to get out there, is literally physically get out into the places where the people are, into car parks, by stations, and say, how did you get here? And if obviously they're in the car park, they're probably driven. What would make them change? Why do they not use a bus? Is there a bus? There's a lot of research that's been done about travel to railways in outer towns that suggests people don't want to go by bus, they want to go by car. But actually that's generally because they're asking people who are in a free car park. so it kind of biases the answer. But we do quite a lot of on-street events, obviously interrupted somewhat by the pandemic, and where we go out and talk to people on the street about how they've come in to wherever it is we've gone to, big shopping centre, transport hub, airport, you know, town centre, wherever, or schools or universities or wherever people just can be found to assemble, and just ask them some questions and let them talk to you. We normally take all the local operators and local authority reps with us so that they can actually ask people responsible. Quite often the people who we ask to come are terrified that they're just going to get hammered by the local people. But actually it doesn't turn out that way. Mostly you might get one awkward cuss, there's always one. But mostly people have got great ideas and a deep desire to see things getting better, because they're very aware of social isolation.
We've lost you slightly there, Claire.
Very aware of people.
Thanks. Sorry, I think we've lost you, Claire, on the feed slightly. Can I move on to asking a question?
We're aware of climate change now, thankfully. So they're looking to do something, but they're not entirely sure what, other than recycling. Do you do it? Have you lost?
It's really breaking up.
Sorry, I'll keep talking, and if you can't hear me, then.
Oh, she's got.
Okay, I'll turn my camera off. Is that any better?
Well, Claire, can we move on to just asking a question?
I've turned my camera off.
Can we just move on to sort of augmenting that question a little bit? Because one of the things that I've wondered about in the launch of HeartsLinks is the built environment. Have you considered signage and bus stop type things to inform people about the service?
That's a good question. I think just on the previous point as well, we obviously did a number of roadshows over the summer, and that was amazing to get out and speak to local people. And one such example, the Buntingford car show, classic car show at the end of the summer, which I recommend if you're ever in the area. But, you know, we had the HeartsLinks vehicle there. From that, we were just able to chat to loads of people who suggested virtual bus stops in other places in the town that we hadn't considered, new developments where there might be a really good appetite for that. So I think linking into that point as well, we are considering that and looking at particularly where there's new developments, where there's things that we can tap into, sort of unlock demand, linked into obviously the usual Section 106 processes we go through anyway. I think that's a key consideration for the future. I think in terms of the base service, we sort of tried to plan it based around where we felt there was community need, especially linking into the 6 key town hubs, and also realising that we couldn't create too much demand at first, if you like, because we knew we were going to jump from 3 vehicles this year to 5 vehicles next year, where we can really start to unlock some of that demand next year. So there was always a sort of staggered plan for how we'd launch a service, if that makes sense.
Right. Simon, did you come up with any thoughts about actual, rather than just having virtual infrastructure, but having actual infrastructure to kind of, I think I've always found that the research about stations and house prices around stations was a pretty compelling thing for people value something that looks a bit permanent.
Yeah, I think the key thing is that, I mean, obviously I'm not from the UK, as you can probably tell by my accent, but I found that the UK isn't generally very dry. And so weather conditions is a key thing. So you don't want to be standing out in the conditions. So you need somewhere to be able to stand. And that's not going to work for all types of services, but at least having like key points where you're at least putting that structure so you can bring people together, and that way the service can generally pick up from those locations. We, from TfL's point of view, we were using the existing bus stops that were there and trying to encourage more use of that as well, but also picking up, you also have to identify locations where it's safe to pick up. So you really want to have like kind of virtual spots, but then also encourage as many people as possible to move to a shared or sheltered space, and also have those at your key amenities as well.
And Simon, you've said you've got a question for Andrew about integrating multiple operators, which is an interesting one.
Yeah, so looking through your BSIP, I note that there was 2 different proposals or 2 different existing DRTs that you're looking at. how are you integrating those, or how are you making it so that from a user perspective, they're seeing them as one offer from the council?
It's a really good point. I think a key consideration for us around DRT particularly is the amount of different apps or ways of using TRT you could end up with, which is why we're really keen to pursue the HeartsLinks brand and bring that together almost as a DRT brand within the county, appreciating other operators might do commercial things if they choose to, obviously, within the realms of what they can do. I think with the extension and expansion we're looking at in the BSIP, I think there's two areas I think mentioned. I think there's one mention around a new DRT in Tring and this sort of area of the west of the county, as well as a possible expansion of the current HeartsLinks down into Hertford, so going further south. I think it's early days. I think that's what the analysis has shown in terms of where DRT could work for us, with some of the analysis we've done and speaking to local communities and feedback we've had obviously since the initial launch. But I think a key consideration for us will be to work with operators in those areas now as the BSIP develops and we get recommendations from the DFT around how we can further integrate those into fixed route timetables, rail stations, and ticketing as well, which is a key consideration, because I think the whole principle of the BSIP is to make things easier for the passenger and for customers to drive that patronage increase. We don't want to introduce a load of DRT that makes things more complicated and difficult, but maybe serves a little subset of passengers in the county. So I think, to be honest, there's a lot of work to do on that and analysis. As you can appreciate, I think most local authorities are it's a bit of a wait and see game in terms of the funding and what we can do with what we've outlined to sort of pursue that work.
Oh, you mentioned the magic funding word. There are a lot of questions coming in about the viability of DRT, and everything from can you see this becoming commercially viable as a service, as in it pays for itself, to what are you seeing as augmenting services or replacing underfunded services, or services that you found difficult to fund? So funding, tell us about it and how much, where the needle lies.
I think it's quite important to be open that, as I mentioned in the presentation, we secured funding through the Rural Mobility Fund. Realistically, we wouldn't have been able to launch a service without that. So I think that's the first thing. I think what that gives us is a couple of years breathing space to try and do what we can with the service. And we've done the initial launch. We're keen to increase patronage, increase the vehicles in the service zone. I think broadly with DRT, some are going to be commercial, some aren't. And I think the ones that aren't commercial is looking at our normal mode of how we support contracted services in the county and how we make those value for money decisions. I think being open again, that I think most services in that area of the county have never scored amazingly for value for money in terms of fixed bus route. So I think, to be open, some will survive. I think DRT wise commercially, some won't. I think it just gives us some breathing space now to work on it and work out how it can either be integrated into that sort of total transport strategy, which I mentioned in the presentation, supported by the local authority, or if it can stand in its own right. I think that's probably what we need to take the next couple of years to prove in Hertfordshire.
And onto this commercial propensity for the DRT, is it possible that you could build up patronage to such an extent that you then replace it with a fixed line bus route with timetables and all of the usual stuff? I'm going to ask Jack as well, because I know you've got experience of this too. But for Hertfordshire, is that possible?
I think there's probably two things. So I think you might have seen on our BSIP, if you've read it. I know Simon sounds like he has. In terms of the long-term plan, we obviously started consultation on a rapid transit for east to west of the county, but that's very early stages. So I think in terms of a long-term plan, it's looking at how demand responsive and the HeartsLinks brand can complement that as well. But we're talking around 10 to 15 years here for that. I think in the short term, I think it's looking at the local bus routes. We have a contract in that area. So I think I saw a question about whether we've had modal shift or turned off any of those other local bus routes. We've not at the moment, because we didn't want to create that pressure that passengers are losing something, and they might have that perception they're losing something when HeartsLinks has been introduced, which we don't think is the case anyway. So we wanted to give ourselves a bit of breathing space again on that. But the key thing will be to look at the fixed bus routes in the area, in the county, and how they complement the HeartsLinks we've set up and how they can work together. But I think the other critical point is, if fixed bus routes haven't been given enough to succeed, I don't think we should throw all of our eggs in the basket of DRT, if that makes sense. I think it's sort of a level playing field, that we should give fixed bus routes a chance to succeed just as much as we are doing with HeartsLinks.
So Heartflinks is not replacing anything existing, it's an additional service effectively.
Initially, I think we need to, as I said, it gives us breathing space for a couple of years to look at those that analysis and if any modal shifts occurred from those low frequency routes in the area. Yeah.
Okay, and Jack, you've done work in France, or Padam has done work in France, where there's where that equation has been looked at.
Yeah, and I suppose before I talk about that example, just to agree with Andrew, really, there's nothing wrong with a fixed line bus route. Fixed line buses have been operated for hundreds of years, from horse and cart and everything, and actually it's one of the most optimal ways to carry large numbers of people from A to B. DRT shouldn't be about replacing all fixed line buses. It should be about looking at where the customer experience is poor and trying to enhance it. So there's routes that I used to run as a general manager for a bus operator in Leighton Buzzard, for example. There's a group of town routes that go up and down every single street in a small market town, take 5 times as long as the car, because the way that the roads are laid out, it has to go round every street to get to the centre. And actually scenarios like that maybe could be a lot better served with demand responsive bus. So it's not just about replacing fixed line bus at all. It's about making the public transport system more engaging to passengers, to actually think, actually, I'm going to use this, I'm going to leave my car at home. But on the building DRT up and then replacing it to a fixed line bus, it really does have the capability to do that. So in France, many of the regions have measures, and basically what they look at is, if we can get the cost per passenger to a certain level through DRT, then actually we can look to replace that DRT service with fixed line bus. So we've had use cases where we've replaced traditional dial-a-ride services that on average were costing, say, €20 per passenger per journey, and adding the app on top of the call center and the booking website has managed to get that cost per passenger down to between €5 and €7 per passenger per journey. And at that point, the local authority has decided, actually, we've now got the passenger base to re-implement a fixed line route, and we'll utilize the DRT system in a different area and try and build that up. So that can be done as well. It could be that you replace a percentage of the DRT vehicles with a fixed line bus, but you keep a few to feed a new fixed route. So there's lots of different ways to do it, and it's not about DRT being a singular answer. It's about it integrating into a wider network.
Thank you. So we have absolutely stacks of questions coming in, and most of them for Andrew. So I'm really sorry to put you on the hot seat here, because everyone wants to know, how kind of like things like demand and patronage, because the proof of the pudding is in the eating. You're doing it online, and everyone else is kind of peeping over the brink here, looking at what they can expect. How are your predictions, and how accurate were they?
Yeah, so I think I've just seen that question. In terms of planning, it went back to obviously the business case work that we did to submit to the DFT, and probably shouldn't mention, Jack, but we did use another DRT to do operator to do some technology operator to do some simulations for us and use their tool to help us plan the area and the network, and also obviously speak to the local communities. I think that led us to forecast patronage mainly for weekdays and an average patronage. We also appreciated that year one, as I mentioned, we started with 3 vehicles, and the real scaling up will be going to 5 vehicles next year, where we expect patronage to hopefully increase and unlock that demand that we think's there. In terms of initially the first sort of 6 weeks we've got data for, I think weekday patronage is pretty close to our forecast. I'll be honest, it's not too far off, but also we need to keep an eye over the next couple of months, because obviously you get that initial flurry. And I think you might have seen, Jack, in the data that we had thousands of registrations, and obviously naturally after a few weeks that's tailed off. So we've got a really good solid user base that started with us now and have continued to book, which is great, which has helped us get to our forecasted patronage for weekdays. But the challenge really over the next few months is to increase that user base and grow from there. So that's what we'll be trying to do.
So we've also got some quite interesting questions about what about DRT kind of drawing passengers away from active travel, and also becoming a glorified taxi. Too much use of DRT. So does that, Simon, Claire's still on the line. Do either of you have any research about health issues, whether people are going to use it instead of being walking and cycling?
And I'm sorry you can't see me for some reason. I've had to come in on my mobile and it doesn't want to show me. Probably that's an advantage. We're not a research organisation, but certainly I think if people want to walk or cycle, they'll walk or cycle. But there are the fair weather walkers and cyclists who are happy to do so when it's sunny and lovely, but much less likely to do so when it's shucking it down and absolutely freezing. So I find it a bit difficult to conceptualise too much use of DRT. I think if it's meeting the needs of the people better than the regular bus services, then we can all learn from that. And if I can just comment briefly on things that Andrew was talking about, the move from one type of service to another, I think there ought to be a seamless service, a seamless process in place, so that if you start to see the figures rising, so that it could have a better option for to be viable for a commercial operator, then that ought to all be in place, that it's easy to achieve, and vice versa. When a regular service is actually losing passengers hand over fist, then it should be able to be put something in place so that the passenger doesn't suffer a delay or a break, which will affect confidence.
Just to build on that, I think we need to be careful not to define people as a walker, a cyclist, or a public transport user. Generally, there's people are a mixture of those, and sometimes they're a driver, sometimes they're a passenger, and other things, obviously. So that goes back to that seasonality issue. But also, what we find is that if people are taking sustainable transport, that's a better outcome than car. And I think this is what we're really seeing here, is it's a battle against climate change that we're really dealing with, and congestion, and our community is. So if it's supporting that, all for the better. But also the types of trips, which, although we're saying, it's pick up from A and drop you at B, and it can go anywhere, we're not necessarily saying that it's going to take you a trip that you would have walked anyway. I think when we were talking around at TfL, there was definitely discussions around that. So we might say, have you thought about walking this, or are you aware this would take this long to walk? Well, obviously walking speeds different people, but so it's unlikely to take away a walk trip necessarily, unless it's just a leg of your public transport journey. Maybe it might take away that last leg, first or last mile, but a cycling trip is less likely to, is where it's more likely to potentially delve into. But if a person's, you're generally going to get people coming from and choosing to cycle on when they cycle, I think, not necessarily the other way around.
Yeah, it's really interesting that kind of like, we need to have all of the possible options available to people to persuade them out of their cars. There is no single magic bullet. There are quite a few questions about planning in the box about below. Is DRT service an excuse to continue the current epidemic of low density car dependent development? And then there's another question about parking. I think this is a little bit about the what you were talking about, Simon, about being able to prioritise bus over car in all circumstances. We've got a question where someone's saying, shouldn't we just be solving the fact that buses can't get round down some roads because of the car parking issues, not by putting DRT in, but by solving the car parking issues? So how do you see cars and DRT interacting? Will DRT facilitate low density planning? Is it actually just giving into the car, or are we or can it pull us out of a car dependent society?
that for me?
Yeah, that's for you.
Great. I think
I feel mean now.
yeah, there's definitely a range which we're looking at there, right? So DRT in a very, very dense area like central London, not really that practical. But as you get out to more rural areas or towns and things, that's where you can get a good opportunity. Once it gets extremely spread, I think that's where you need to go back, consider moving back, in my view anyway, to you'll lose, and there'll be a point where you lose density, so much so that a fixed route service that does run, once an hour or something like that might still be the way back to go, the way to go. So I think there is an element of some areas where you're looking at that low density development where I think DRT could address that planning issue. But so with other things like car clubs, for example, so that you still have that option where you don't need to own a car, but you can share the car use or shared cycles and things like that as well. So I think it needs to be part of a package, and that package needs to then as well be saying, well, actually in those developments, if you are going to own a car and are going to pay for a car, well, why don't we take that thing for your parking and actually use it to help provide the service, so that you at least have that service at other times and other people have that service as well. So there's an element around that where your funding is going to have to come a little bit from parking, and then also looking at where, so the similar thing we would do with a bus route, where we say, where are the congestion hotspots where you can't get, or reliability hotspots, identifying those and actually solving them. It's a lot more complicated with non-fixed routes, but it's still doable and still required. And with the technology that Jack has, I'm pretty sure he could identify those places where his vehicles are stuck quite easily. So that's again about that communication with the council and to and through.
Jack, do you want to answer? I mean, I know that when Arriva Click was set up in Sittingbourne, there were quite a lot of congestion issues, and it was partly because of that that it seemed like a good place to try out a demand responsive transport.
Yeah, so there's a couple of bits, I suppose, to do with parking that that I'd like to touch upon. In New Lubbersthorpe in Leicester, they opted to not implement a fixed line bus route for their new residents, but to implement a package of different travel measures to, one, try to attract people to buy the houses on the estate, because they thought, actually, if we have a package of different mobility offers, it might be attractive for people to come and live here. But also they use that in their planning, in their revised transport strategy, to show how they were going to try and reduce car usage. So obviously when I was with Arriva, we launched Arriva Click there. Robin Poynton was appointed the travel planner, and he implemented a wide range of other offers, including free e-bikes up to the price, or £500 off an e-bike for every new resident, and lots of other offers. And I know from hearing some of the stats that they've had some really good usage of active travel or sort of public transport usage for a new development that looks on paper like it should attract big SUV type drivers with big 4-bedroom houses on the outskirts of the city. So I think that's one element of sort of combating new developments with new mobility. In terms of sort of the combating parking in sort of town and city centres, I think DRT is only one element. It has to be a package, and this is where I think the real arguments for mass is, because I think if you give people a whole wide range of measures through a solution which is easy to use, that's when you'll start to get real change of people not driving into a town or city centre. If it's just one option which isn't potentially available to do a certain trip, it's not going to get people out of the car. There needs to be a wide range of different modes and means, car clubs, there needs to be, I don't know, scooters, e-bikes, whatever the different modes are, that people can pick and choose based on what journey they're making that day and where they need to go. So I think that's where we'll see real impact, I hope and pray, to reduce car usage.
Thanks. More questions about the disabled access. I think there's quite a lot of questions about whether DRT is purely a social extension of community transport and enabling mobility. And then there's another group of questions that are, you know, some of the services that we've had have been pretty poor on disabled access. I don't know, Claire, if you have any comments on that kind of balance. You know, the original Reaver Click had wheelchair access, but some of the services you were mentioning didn't have any, were poor on accessibility. Do you have any reflections on that?
I mean, I think it's, I mean, all scheduled buses now have to be accessible to people in a wheelchair. And if you want people to be able to travel spontaneously, then you need to have that option available. Doesn't necessarily mean every vehicle will be that, but if you're going to run them on a loop version so that people can just turn up and go, then it has to be accessible, no question. There have been some, well, I think the COP26 conference showed one particular Israeli minister turned up in a wheelchair and they kept sending an inaccessible vehicle. And there just isn't any sense in that, because it makes people feel like they're not welcome, they shouldn't be there. That's not what you want your customers to feel. So I think you need to make it plain that you'd like to know so that you can be sure to send the right sort of vehicle. And it's not just for wheelchairs, by the way. There are all sorts of design issues that are helpful for disabled people. You need to have a space for your assistance dog to be comfortable and not shoved up against somebody else's leg. You need to have darker floors, but not black floors, because people with dementia and various forms of autism will think they're falling into a void and won't travel. So there's a lot of issues around vehicle design that need to be taken into account. But an awful lot of the people who are going to be using the service might equally be happy with just a car or a multi-person vehicle. So I think you need to know your audience, know your customers, like we keep saying. So that's I think the best thing I can say is know your customers.
And then the other question, I don't know if anyone else wants to jump in with, is DRT just an extension of or a better way of organising community transport? Any takers?
I think one thing to mention about, I guess, because we've been doing some good engagement with our community transport providers over the summer for the BSIP, and I think it's important that community transport providers aren't neglected in this. I think they offer a really vital service in the community. That also goes to our own council services like Dial a Ride and all of our home to school and adult social care operations as well, in terms of providing transport. So I think it needs to reflect what the community needs from demand responsive schemes and incorporate community transport providers into those discussions, at least, if not help with the design and how it can integrate with their schemes as well. Because again, we don't want to encourage, I think, realistically, modal shift from community transport providers, because we want to encourage them to be in the space as well and what they can do. So yeah, I think it's a really important point, and we've tried in Hertfordshire to listen to our community transport providers, incorporate that into a bit of a plan in the BSIP, which we've hopefully reflected to the DFT. But I think it is a critical element, definitely.
Jack, in the Padam experience has been a little bit that you have provided in France both that better way of organising, optimising community transport services, but also commuter services and all sorts of other things. Do you want to talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, so in a lot of the regions, we worked with the authority and the operators in the region to integrate multiple operators with multiple different styles of DRT under one overarching platform. And what this helps really is to sort of get the economies of scale, I suppose. So if everyone's working in silos, they've got their own customer base, but if they go into a slightly different area, then they don't necessarily know that this community transport operator or this operator is here. And if you're a user and you don't know it's there, then you're not going to be able to use it. So in Paris, for example, in Pays de la Loire, We have multi-territory ability through our app to work with small, sometimes very small operators in terms of volunteer operators or one bus operators, and integrate them into the platform, work with them to understand how their style of DRT works, and then have one overarching brand, potentially like maybe Hearts Links or whatever that brand may be, but then be able to have these small regional DRTs run by community or voluntary operators, and then when someone from a different part of the region goes to that area, they'll be familiar with the app, and they'll be able to use that service. What that helps to do is increase revenue, reduce subsidy, and just boost the overall awareness of community transport operators. But the key is to work very closely in the integration phase, learn how their style of DRT works, because you don't want to neglect the passenger base that they have and that they already use.
Thanks, Jack. And I think that kind of comes back to sort of funding and the differences between France and the UK. In France, you actually have a law that entitles you to mobility that's non-car based. So there is a kind of fundamental imperative for councils in France to organise transport within a certain distance of people's actual homes, which we've not kind of got here. It looks like we're making some steps. Do we know how widespread, Jack? I don't know, or Simon possibly, applications have been for DRT funding in BSIPs or coverage of DRT funding in BSIPs? I've got a question here, how many councils have not even considered it? I suspect no one's not considered it at all, but how's that documented?
So if I just pick that up to start with, I've probably read about 60 BSIPs in the past week, and quite a lot of BSIPs are suggesting that they're going to obviously implement schemes. Out of them 60, 59 say they have plans to implement the scheme. I think the only one that I read was Brighton that said we've analysed it, and actually we think in our network it's not something that is necessary right now. A lot of councils are looking at current trials, and many have mentioned they want to actually see the learnings from the current trials before they commit to operating a DRT. And then there's a proportion of councils which have firmly said this is a core element that we want to address and we want to launch. Now, it's still to be seen the percentage of revenue that's going to be distributed by the DfT, because I'm sure that if you add all the BSIP asks together, it's a massive number, and let's see if the funding comes in April and how it's distributed.
Simon or Claire, any more BSIP analysis?
I think it's a bit like what we're seeing with bus priority in the BSIPs. If they know about it, it's there and quite good. And if they don't, it's kind of mentioned. So I think like Andrew's one has it in there quite well because they have services. But others, there's just a little bit less detail. So I haven't read as many as Jack. I am making my way through them though, and so is my team. But yeah, I haven't come across one yet that doesn't mention DRT. So at least they're aware of it.
Right.
Yeah,
sorry, Claire.
Sorry, we're involved in quite a few BSIP development plans, and all the ones we've been involved with certainly have had a discussion about it at a variety of levels, depending on their commitment and their research in their own communities. But yeah, I mean, it's a tool in the toolkit. So I would have thought most local authorities would at least look at it, even if they scratch their heads and think, I'm not sure how that would work around here. I haven't actually done the mind-boggling tool that you talked about, Andrew, about sorry, was it Andrew? I'm not sure who was talking, but probably Jack, about reading 60 of them. I think I might fall over if I did that. But I think it's going to come out in the wash when we see how many of them get any kind of next stage success rate from the DFT. So I don't think those that haven't explained themselves on every front won't be likely to get much support.
So we're kind of winding up a bit. Simon, we're sort of winding up a little bit. Do we maybe go round the panelists here and maybe everyone picks a hope and a fear for DRT in the next sort of in the enhanced partnerships that are being formed in the future? So, focus on something that you think is going to potentially be really good for good for bus networks and active travel and shifting to net zero, and maybe some and a worry. Do you want to kick off, Simon?
Sure. So I am really hoping that through this process, someone can show me a DRT that is funding itself, either that through other mechanisms like parking and other things tied into it. I'm okay with that, but something that is like self-sufficient in some way. I'd love to see that, and if anyone finds it, they're welcome to come talk to me about it. And then the other thing I'm a bit concerned about is what we have seen with some councils, where they just throw out the bus service, too much of the bus service. It's like anything that's under subsidy, we're getting rid of, and we're just going to bring in DRT. I think that's just going a bit too far, and that really scares me if we go down that path. I think there's a balance in there somewhere.
Okay, so recycling funding to fund DRT, but not getting rid of bus routes. Claire, can we move over to you and see about your hopes and fears for DRT and the enhanced partnerships that are coming forward?
Well, I hope that bus will be the major player in a massive change for public movement, so that there will be options for people to ditch their cars for at least half the time. And let people breathe again. My one concern is that transport's still in this silo, and it is within local authorities, so it's not underpinning employment, education, health, and housing. God, housing. So somebody brought up in the questions about building housing developments that are all twisty-turny and might look pretty on an architect's model, but actually don't allow for any sensible transport options to be put in place and make them car dependent. I'm afraid that sort of stuff is still going to continue when they think, oh well, we've got a BSIP now, so we've ticked the climate change box. That would do.
Yeah, no, it's a massive worry, and yes, we have lots of unfolding in the over the next few months as I think we're into the statutory consultation period now on enhanced partnerships, or we will be shortly, and then everything should be in place by April. But yeah, who knows? And let's hope that we carry on pressing for good transport networks and links throughout the community. Andrew, do you want to hope and fear?
I think probably my main hope is probably the hope we saw. It sounds a bit soppy, but the hope we saw when we chatted to people at the roadshows in the summer who have maybe not had any sort of access to a public transport service for years in some of these villages, and the fact they could see a vehicle that they'd be able to book and use and get somewhere. And I think already with the hundreds, if not into the thousands of journeys we've seen so far on a service, even if not all of those are from cars, a large proportion is going to have been, or they would have just been stuck at home. So I think it's important when it's discussing different modes, at the heart of this is people can get out and about and travel to where they want to. So I think my hope is, whether it's DRT or anything, we can continue to do that on public transport and active travel. I think my fear is probably, as we discussed a little bit today, that DRT is put on such a pedestal, that there's such high expectations, it's given up on really quickly because it doesn't quite match those expectations. And I think everybody in this space is quite realistic about what those expectations should be, and then it should complement the network as a whole. But I think sometimes maybe the buzz around it when things are being launched and there's new things runs away with itself a little bit. So my fear is probably people giving up on it a bit quickly, and it sort of goes again and comes back in another generation, because I think really it needs to be here to stay now and reflect the ambition of what we want to do with the wider public transport network.
Yeah, I completely agree. I often say we've had about at least 70 years of behavioural shift towards the car, and we're trying to counteract that in the next few years to get to net zero. So we've kind of got to throw the kitchen sink at it and really put our weight behind it, and even if we modify things, not go backwards, because otherwise we're going to let that behavioural shift to the car just carry on its invincible march with all of the consequences that has to the climate and society. Jack, do you want to give us your hopes and fears?
Yeah, sure. So we talk a lot about making sure DRT is commercially viable, and actually it can be commercially viable in different ways. So we've got large fleets of vehicles sitting in depots all across the UK in different sectors doing very similar things, but often not being fully utilised and costing a lot of money. So for example, you may have a fleet of community transport vehicles in cities that do certain things in the peaks but don't do anything in the middle of the day. You've got non-emergency patient vehicles that potentially are being underutilised. You've got SEN transport where maybe 180 different vehicles converge on a school because the technology hasn't aggregated some of the trips right, and a wide range of different use cases for different forms of DRT. And I think to get it commercially viable, one of the key things is to have real life examples over a long period of time where different silos have been mixed together to raise patronage, to lower the cost of DRT and to make efficiencies. And when we start to see those types of examples, then they can hopefully be scaled and then offer a DRT to more people, fill in more gaps in transport networks, because you've managed to save money in other ways to help subsidise DRT services. So I'd like to see that sort of total transport, now that the technology is there to mix sort of community paratransit door to door with corner to corner, to actually see that be implemented, because I think the technology has now caught up. Whereas maybe 6-7 years ago, when the total transport trials were there, we didn't really have the app-based technology. So that would be my sort of hope. And then my fear is that that some of the trials or some of the implementations will be standalone and won't be integrated into the wider network, and you won't see the full benefit then of DRT, because it's sort of working on its own silo and not helping to integrate with other modes. So yeah, they would be my two.
Could I just jump in on this whole viability thing and making it pay for itself and all the rest of it? People are adding apples and oranges, and they're not actually looking at the cost of social care for the people who are socially isolated. They're not looking at the cost of unemployment locally for the people who can't get to a job reliably. They're not looking at the on-costs of having bad transport links. So saying the simple addition of whether the passenger numbers and the subsidy cancel each other out is not the way to look at transport. It's a completely social, it's a social premium, and you need to have it in order for society to work at all.
And just to build on that thing, as I was the one who kind of brought that up, and I agree with both of you, all of you. What I'm meaning is we need to work out, how do you bridge that funding gap then, and how do you bring in other revenue streams that are tied to it to support it so it can continue to go.
Yeah, it's not just about fares revenue, for sure. So I mean, we are right on the 12 o'clock line. I want to let you all go, and thank you very, very much for joining us. I mean, my personal hope is to see that DRT is properly part of that enhanced partnership, and it's expanding the network and integrating it and making sure more people have got access to buses, and that buses are competitive with car journeys. I think the biggest problem that I see in where I am is that it's just so much slower and so much more convoluted to go by bus at the moment. So because of the distance to fast bus routes and all sorts of other factors. So seeing my aspiration for DRT is that it becomes part of this enhanced network that is part of the aspirations for bus service improvements. I'm not going to have a beer because I want to end on an upbeat note. So thank you everyone for joining us, and have a great lunchtime. Take care. Goodbye.
Thanks all. Bye bye.